Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the History of Elections in America. Episode 2, The Virginia Company. Today, I'm going to discuss the early political history of Jamestown, the first successful colony in what would become the United States, leading up to the creation of the first legislature in British America and the first real elections. But before we get to Jamestown, we need to take a step back and explore the Atlantic world in the 1500s, to understand why 104 English adventurers sailed to Virginia in the first place. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, searching for a trade route to Asia, instead stumbled upon the Americas, uncharted continents that held everything from tiny tribes to vast empires. But the arrival of Europeans to the New World was an unparalleled disaster for the Native Americans. European diseases like smallpox ravaged North and South America for centuries, eventually reducing the native population by perhaps 90%. And the Portuguese and Spanish had been quick to take advantage of the instability they caused. Conquistadors overthrew weakened empires and won for Spain lands stretching from Florida and Mexico in the north down to Chile and Argentina in the south. Additionally, the Portuguese had been in Brazil since 1500. Within decades, the map of the Americas had been totally redrawn. But beyond those two powers, the European presence in the New World was fleeting. An English expedition led by John Cabot in 1497 had been the first to reach North America since the Viking era, but the region had still hardly been touched, at least directly. Both France and England had attempted to establish colonies in North America in the 1500s, but these had all failed. Most famously, the inhabitants of the English colony of Roanoke in North Carolina simply disappeared without a trace in the 1580s. So, beyond fishing expeditions to the Canadian coast and a few French fur trading outposts, there was no significant European presence north of Florida. European diseases were only just starting to reach this part of the world in full force, but it had always been sparsely populated. Bernard Bailyn estimates that there were only about 300,000 people living in the entire region from the Carolinas all the way to Nova Scotia. For comparison, England had about 4 million people at this time, and London alone had 200,000 people. The Powhatan tribe, which was inhabiting the lower Chesapeake when the English arrived, had a population of perhaps 14,000. Negligible in comparison. There were no cities other than those of the Iroquois much further north. Villages of a few hundred were the norm, and apart from the Iroquois Confederacy there was little in the way of large-scale political organization either. Many groups were organized into somewhat loose chiefdoms of a few thousand people, as with the Powhatan, where various chiefs ruled over groupings of towns with the paramount chief who ruled over them all. And these chiefdoms were unstable in the long run. The Powhatan's rule predated the English arrival at Jamestown by only a few decades. None of these peoples had developed metallurgy. There was no writing. There was agriculture, but it was more gardening than the growing of huge fields of cereal crops. It was a region totally unlike England and totally unprepared for the destructive change the English were about to unleash. Back in Europe, the age of exploration was also the age of Reformation, and that change is just as important in understanding the English colonization of America. In Columbus's day, all of Western Europe, from Italy to Iceland and from Spain to Sweden, was united by the Catholic Church, and while monarchs often chafed at the Pope's attempts to wield power, his spiritual authority was beyond question. But that all changed. In 1517, 25 years after Columbus's voyage, Martin Luther, a German monk, nailed 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg. Luther was a reformer who wanted to challenge the corruption of the church as well as many of its beliefs. But the debate he began spiraled out of control. Soon, many reformists, including Luther, were breaking away from the Pope altogether. It wasn't what he'd wanted at first, but the horse of schism was out of the barn. The next century and a half would see nation after nation descend into brutal wars over religion. In the end, much of Northern Europe broke away from papal authority, founding their own national churches based on a variety of new Protestant doctrines. To oversimplify, these new denominations were generally opposed to the elaborate hierarchies and elaborate rituals of Catholicism. Vernacular languages were favored over Latin. The monastic life was rejected, as was priestly celibacy. Christianity was nationalized and stripped down, and its separateness from society was greatly reduced. But in England, the Reformation took a peculiar course, less minimalist and less hostile to grandeur and hierarchy. I'm going to explain this in a bit of detail because the various strands of Christianity in England will all have their part to play in the colonies. Instead of being driven by theologians, the English Reformation was driven by the monarchy. Famously, in the 1520s, Henry VIII was seeking an annulment of his first marriage so that he might marry his mistress. The Pope refused, so in the early 1530s, Henry broke the English Church away from papal control and put himself at its head. This was a political maneuver. Henry himself was no religious radical. He was happy to dissolve the monasteries in England and sell off the valuable land to line his own pockets, but he had little interest in deeper doctrinal changes. Although there was now some support in England for Protestant ideas, at least among the intelligentsia, Henry steered a cautious course and cracked down on Protestants who went too far for his tastes. But upon his death in 1547, the increasingly confused religious situation led to violence. His son, Edward VI, took the throne. Edward, though not yet a teenager, had become a fervent Protestant, and his brief reign was one of rapid reform. Anything deemed too Catholic was thrown out and banned. The church was thoroughly remade from the top down. However, Edward's rule lasted only 6 years. He was followed by his half-sister Mary, who was as fervently Catholic as he had been Protestant. She brought England back into the Catholic fold and did everything in her power to roll back the reforms of the previous few years. She also led a violent crackdown on Protestants, executing several hundred while she was on the throne. Though Protestants persecuted Catholics too, it was Mary's violence, so-called Bloody Mary, that would live on in the popular imagination. Hatred and fear of Catholicism lingered in England for centuries to come. But Mary's rule would be even briefer than Edward's had been. In 1558, she died, and her half-sister, Elizabeth I, took the throne. Elizabeth would rule for 45 years, and it was under her that a new English Protestantism would finally emerge from the chaos. She was at heart a cautious Protestant, looking to make the break with Rome permanent while steadfastly avoiding any of the radical social experiments happening elsewhere in Europe. She succeeded, to the exasperation of many Protestants who wanted her to go much further. As a result, the new Anglican faith she created was far more similar in style and practice to Catholicism than most other Protestant branches. But whatever it was still anti-Catholic. It's hard to say exactly when a majority of the English people became Protestant. Most people had just kept their heads down during the initial era of violence and confusion. But certainly by the end of Elizabeth's reign in 1603, England was strongly and proudly Protestant. By that point, most citizens had never known anything else. Religious questions had by no means been settled, but from now on the English would be a self-consciously Protestant people. So, when colonization began, England could be divided into 3 main religious groups. The small but hated Catholic minority was on one side, and on the other side there were those who wanted the Reformation to go even further, the Puritans. Most were in the middle, cautious Anglicans who liked things the way they were. Each of these groups would try to establish themselves in the Americas, reproducing the conflicts of England in their new homes. The late 1500s also saw England continue to modernize. The state was gradually becoming more centralized and more effective. Merchants in London and other port cities were becoming a powerful force in their own right, distinct from the rural aristocracy that had previously dominated politics. The financial system was becoming more complicated. Most important for our story is the invention of the joint stock company. Unlike in a simple partnership where a handful of people would pool their resources together in some cooperative venture, in a joint stock company, outsiders could invest in shares of the company without assuming liability and without needing to take an active role in management, in exchange for being paid dividends at some point in the future. This is, in essence, the modern idea of buying stocks. This allowed private merchants to pursue more complicated and risky ventures than had previously been possible. Hence, it was a perfect fit for trading abroad. Under this model, the monarch would create a company with a royal charter and give it a monopoly on trade in a given region of the world. The East India Company, which would eventually conquer much of India in later centuries, was one of these. But in Elizabeth's time, expeditions were sent all over the globe, from Africa to the Arctic. This was the model on which the Virginia Company was based, a private company, but one with government support. So, that's the basic situation across the Atlantic. When Elizabeth died in 1603, England was on the rise. The English were now both able and willing to pursue ventures abroad. The Americas were ripe for conquest, and England was ready to try. It was a logical next step. Everything was in place, economically and politically. There were even solid ideological motives, both increasing the nation's prestige and spreading Protestantism at the expense of Catholicism. To quote a propagandist from the time, "The eyes of all Europe are looking upon our endeavors to spread the gospel among the heathen people of Virginia. to plant an English nation there and to settle a trade in those parts. Elizabeth had no children, and so she was succeeded by James I, who was already King of Scotland. It was under him that Jamestown, Virginia would be founded. In future episodes, we'll also explore in greater detail life in England around this time, since it's so vital in the understanding of American colonial history. But back to the narrative. The Virginia Company was a joint stock company chartered by the king, on behalf of well-placed investors, in 1606 to oversee the creation of 2 colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America. One, in Maine, would fail within a year, so we can ignore it. But the other, Jamestown, would survive against all odds. The main goals of the expedition included finding silver or gold and finding a navigable route to the Pacific. Of course, no one had any idea how far away the Pacific truly was and how hopeless their goals were. These were basically get-rich-quick schemes aimed at getting a high enough potential return to justify the huge financial risk. This was all new, and no one knew that agriculture would wind up being the key to financial success. But the investors covered their bases. The company was granted a monopoly on all, quote, lands, woods, soil, grounds, havens, ports, rivers, mines, minerals, marshes, water, fishing, and commodities within their new colonies. Since the natives weren't Christian, any property rights they might have had could safely be ignored. But while the company had its monopoly in Virginia, the Crown had its monopoly on the company. The new colony would be allowed to trade only with Britain and no one else. This was a time when the mercantile system was favored over free trade. How was the colony to be run? Although the expedition was financed and run privately, the king still made sure he could have his say. The colony was to be governed as follows. Back in England, the king, or more realistically his ministers, were to appoint a council of 14 men from within the Virginia Company to oversee the project as a whole. This council in England would then select another council from among the members of the expedition to administer the colony itself on site and pass laws, so long as they accorded with the, quote, laws, ordinances, and instructions of the king. This secondary council would also elect a president to act as an administrator with somewhat limited powers. So, James would have ultimate control even if it was to be exercised distantly and judiciously. The company would be restructured several times in its short life, but we don't need to worry about that. Basically, the king controlled the company controlled the council, and the council controlled the colony. What was the status of the colonists? Were they just employees? Well, they weren't just employees, at least. According to Virginia's charter, the colonists and their descendants were to, quote, have and enjoy all liberties, franchises, and immunities within any of our other domains, to all intents and purposes, as if they had been abiding and born within this our realm of England, or any other of our said domains. Of course, these rights that the colonists were granted weren't what we'd think of today as universal rights like free speech. It meant that English customs, such as trials by jury and habeas corpus, were to be maintained. However, in practice, the colony's first years were largely spent in a state of constant martial law, and in any case the colonists were there to serve the company, not to start new lives of their own. So, real English liberties would be hard to come by. The company moved quickly after its creation. On December 20th, 1606, less than a week before the first recorded performance of King Lear, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed from London. They were carrying 105 colonists, all male. 1 man died en route. A large number were surprisingly well off, well educated, and well connected at court. Gentlemen adventurers and soldiers with colorful pasts, not the desperately poor. For instance, John Smith of Pocahontas fame had survived sea battles, killed and beheaded 3 Turks in single combat, and escaped from slavery in the Ottoman Empire all the way to Russia. Others had fought in the wars against Spain or been involved in the colonization of Ireland. There were also some craftsmen, some boys, and a minister. Since there were no women, this was clearly not a colonization effort that was aiming at a long-term, self-perpetuating presence yet. As I said, no one really knew what model would succeed. The Englishmen arrived at Chesapeake Bay after a long and storm-ridden voyage on April 26, 1607. The lush and apparently fertile land they discovered delighted them. The colonists sent out a landing party, but it was quickly attacked by Native Americans. 2 Englishmen were injured, but the Indians withdrew and the Europeans were able to set up camp. I've already sketched a basic outline of how the colony was to be governed, but actually none of the colonists knew what the plan was yet. Perhaps to avoid factionalism while at sea, the Virginia Company back home had decided that the plan should be kept secret until the expedition reached the Chesapeake. Their instructions were kept in sealed boxes with one copy on each ship. Now, at their destination, the box could finally be opened. The council was declared and 7 councilmen were named, the 6 I listed at the start of the episode, plus John Smith, who was at the time already imprisoned for mutiny and facing an execution he would only narrowly escape. Which was lucky for both him and the colony, since after he was freed, Smith would be instrumental in keeping it from being wiped out completely. The council didn't elect their president quite yet. Instead, the expedition set off again the next day, exploring for several weeks the rivers of the Chesapeake for a suitable place to encamp, inland enough to be safe from potential Spanish attack. They had further encounters with Americans, both friendly and hostile. On May 14th, they decided to land on a defensible 2-mile-long peninsula up what they called the James River. They had arrived at Jamestown. They were in the territory of the Powhatan, a fact which would define the early history of Virginia. The 6 councilmen not in chains then elected Edward Murray Wingfield to be their first president for a 1-year term. Wingfield, at 57, was twice as old as many of the other colonists, but he'd had a notable military career, serving in the Netherlands as well as Ireland. He had many connections among the important merchants of the day, and family connections to the expanding plantations in Ireland. He was a natural choice. He ordered the colonists to begin constructing defenses and other public buildings. At first, relations with the Powhatan were merely wary, with both sides trying to feel the other out, but within weeks a party of hundreds of natives led an attack on Jamestown, killing 2. President Wingfield himself was shot through the beard with an arrow. From that point on, relations between the English and the Native Americans would never be very good. The Powhatan immediately had the upper hand. The Europeans were too few in number to really use their superior weaponry, and the colonists soon became dependent upon the Indians for food as well as their provisions began to run out. Yet the Powhatan's leader did not wish to simply wipe out the Europeans, at least not yet. He instead pressed them for valuable foreign goods while keeping them utterly weak and subservient. He alternated between friendliness and hostility as needed. Problems quickly mounted for the colonists. The settlers were increasingly at each other's throats. Repeated attacks by the Indians began to take their toll. Starvation and diseases like malaria hit them hard. The men became too weak to farm, and many of the gentlemen, more interested in finding gold, may have seen farming as beneath them. Occasional gifts of food from the Native Americans helped, but it wasn't enough. By September 10th, half of the men were dead. On that day, the remaining council members deposed Wingfield, which they had the right to do, and arrested him on trumped-up charges of hoarding food and negligence. So ended the 4-month rule of the first, sort of, elected official in British America. It was not an encouraging precedent. Wingfield's character and abilities would come under attack, but I don't know how much you can blame him. Worse disasters would follow, and his successor, John Ratcliffe, would fare no better. There simply weren't enough colonists yet to make headway. The new president, Ratcliffe, had been captain of one of the expedition's ships. He didn't really change policies much because there was little to be done. Further exploration of the Chesapeake by John Smith yielded little. Trading English manufactures for native food was an absolute necessity for survival, but there was little warmth or understanding between the two sides. Commerce and violence could hardly be separated. And the region happened to be in a deep drought, so there was little food to be had on any side. The dying continued. Incidentally, around this time a newly appointed councilman started agitating for the creation of a little parliament in the colony, but this was contrary to the colony's charter, and so the idea was quashed with the arrival of a supply ship from England in January 1608. It was an idea just a little too ahead of its time, I suppose. When the ship left, Wingfield left with it, to face trial in England. He would be acquitted and remain a prominent figure in the Virginia Company, a fate far better than most. Another batch of colonists, which included the first non-British settlers to America, some Polish and German craftsmen, did little to help the colony's precarious position. Ratcliffe, too, was deposed by the council before his term was up thanks to the plotting of John Smith, who would wind up replacing him. Smith proved to be one of the few men who could navigate Jamestown's problems with any success. He had shown himself able in negotiating with the natives and had survived their captivity. But still the raids continued. Any colonist wandering alone was liable to be killed. Smith reciprocated by raiding villages and forcing them to trade for food at gunpoint. He sent some colonists to start new outposts to relieve the food situation in Jamestown. He challenged native leaders to fight him in single combat. It was all very dramatic, but not enough to stabilize the situation. In early 1609, back in England, the Virginia Company was increasingly dismayed by the news coming from America. Their investments in the colony were imperiled, and they knew it. So they took matters into their own hands and reorganized the governance of the colony under a new royal charter. The council was kept on only as an advisory body. A governor with absolute power and answerable to no one else in the colony would be appointed directly by the company. And so ended the first system of elections in what would become the United States, 2 years after it had begun. Although I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this to American history or anything. I mean, Smith was already ruling much more autocratically than his predecessors had, and the elections were about as closed off as possible. The shift to something even closer to straight-up martial law mattered at the time, but neither this new system nor the old one set real precedents for the future. The elections are just a good framework for this episode. In addition to the changes in government, the Virginia Company also doubled down economically. They simply lied about conditions in Jamestown, appealed to patriotism, and secured more investors than maybe 600 more colonists, including some women and children in addition to the usual contingent of soldiers and gentlemen, plus a bunch of vagrants they rounded up. But conditions were still terrible in Jamestown. The rumors that the company was desperately trying to quash were true, and the vast majority of those duped settlers would be dead within the year. This new expedition was hit by a full-on hurricane in the middle of the Atlantic, wrecking the flagship, Sea Venture, off Bermuda. Most of the provisions were lost along with it, so when the remnants of the fleet reached Virginia, they were just bringing even more mouths to feed in an already desperate situation. Also lost were the instructions removing Smith from the governorship. More factional infighting ensued until a gunpowder mishap severely injured Smith and forced him to return to England as soon as possible. His time in Virginia was done. He would later return to America, charting the New England coast and even giving that region its name. He would also write a number of rather self-aggrandizing books about his experience in the New World, which are an important source for our understanding of the period. With Smith out of the picture and no new governor yet, the anti-Smith faction elected one, George Percy, as governor. But without the most competent leader in the colony at the helm, the situation only deteriorated further. Relations with the natives became even worse. The mix of hostility and friendliness became just hostility. Deposed President Ratcliffe was skinned alive with mussel shells by Indians he was attempting to trade with. The colonists were unable to leave their encampment to gather food for fear of attack by the Powhatan. It was now a siege. The food truly ran out, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. This was what was called the starving time. Men hunted rats and ate their boots. In the face of annihilation, the settlers in Jamestown turned to savagery. One man, caught stealing food, was chained to a tree with a needle stuck through his tongue and left to starve to death. Another man murdered and ate his pregnant wife. Of the 500 colonists in Jamestown in late 1609, only 60 would survive the winter. That spring, survivors from the wreck of the Sea Venture unexpectedly appeared. They had built 2 ships on Bermuda and managed to reach the Chesapeake. They hadn't brought much food, of course, but among them was the newly appointed deputy governor, Thomas Gates, who took control of the colony. He was, of course, horrified by the situation he found and utterly at a loss about what to do. But after taking stock of the situation and aiding the survivors as best he could, he decided that there was no choice but to abandon Jamestown and head north for Newfoundland. There they might find food, and hopefully they could make contact with the English fishermen who often sailed there. So, on Gates's order, Jamestown was totally abandoned. The weapons and all available food were loaded on ships. They all set sail out of the Chesapeake, hopefully, towards salvation. Only to be met at the mouth of the bay by yet another English fleet. The new governor, Lord Delaware, after whom the state of Delaware would be named, was on board. He took over from Deputy Governor Gates and ordered everyone to sail straight back to Jamestown. Having no choice, the shell-shocked and resigned survivors complied. Delaware, another former soldier, had brought food though, so the worst of the crisis was at an end. He ran Jamestown more like a military outpost than ever before. Absence from church could be punished by whipping, and to criticize the government 3 times earned you the death penalty. He enforced strict rules against idleness and pressed every man into working for the colony's overall benefit. The church was rebuilt and the defenses were strengthened. Some men were assigned to produce food. The colony didn't thrive by any reasonable definition. 1/3 of the new arrivals died within 6 months, but things were better than before at least. Additionally, the arms and manpower Delaware had brought with him meant that the English were able to finally gain the upper hand over the Indians. Now their superior weaponry could make a real difference. They went on the warpath, burning down villages at the slightest provocation, stealing corn, and massacring men, women, and children. It worked quickly. Delaware was now free to send out expeditions further and further and establish new outposts around the Chesapeake. The Virginia colony was vulnerable, but it was now here to stay. The pattern repeated itself. More colonists arrived, many colonists died. Gradually, headway was made and more outposts were founded. The English presence was spreading. However, Jamestown still lacked an economic reason for existence. The possibilities for gold or a route to the Pacific had evaporated. The commodities sent back to England hadn't been worth anything. So why were they all there, suffering and dying in droves? Martial law couldn't overcome economics. English pride and national expansion wouldn't keep things going forever. It was tobacco that would unexpectedly save Virginia. The Spanish had imported both tobacco and the practice of smoking it from America to Europe, so by the founding of Jamestown there was already a small English market for it. King James himself had written an ineffective pamphlet against the, quote, manifold abuses of this vile custom. He didn't like smoking. In 1612, John Rolfe, the man who would marry Pocahontas, introduced West Indian tobacco to Jamestown and found that it grew quite well. Further experimentation followed over the next few years. In 1614, the first shipment was exported back to Europe. In 1618, 20,000 pounds of tobacco were shipped off. In 1625, 400,000 pounds. At last, there was money to be made. This dovetailed with the change in the Virginia Company's policy. Its ultra-centralized economic model was dead. Increasingly short on funds and looking to get more people to Virginia by any means necessary, the company started offering 50 acres of land to anyone who went. Not only that, if you brought someone else too, you'd get 50 acres of land as well. Before, all land had more or less been held by the company. These smaller holdings began to be consolidated into larger plantations in the name of economic efficiency, and indentured servants were imported to work the land. Indentured servants had their passage to Virginia paid for, but were required to work the land of their master for several years upon arrival, before getting their own plot of land. Sometimes poor people, including poor children, were coerced into leaving. Most, but by no means all, of the immigrants continued to be English. And most of them would still die, from diseases or violence, so growth continued to be slow. But the real foundations of colonial Virginia were finally being laid. The militaristic model was rapidly being discarded as cash crop plantations based on cheap and unfree labor rose to prominence. It wasn't the Virginia of prominent slaveholding families with vast estates yet, but it was getting there. There were also big political changes to match the economic ones, and those will be the topic of our next episode. Because on July 30th, 1619, the first elected assembly in British America met for the very first time in a small wooden church in Jamestown, Virginia. From here on out, elections were to be an increasingly essential part of life in America, a continuity that would be maintained through revolution and war. So join me next time as we discuss the origins of Virginia's General Assembly.